Well, today we are starting a brand new series that I'm extremely excited about. It's a 5-part message series, and the series is called Stand. And what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about how do we stand out, as Jesus followers especially. How do we stand out, particularly in the right ways, at the right time, for the right reasons? Because I believe with all my heart that the content of the next few messages really could impact your life in a very, very significant way. Because when we do stand out in the right ways, at the right time, for the right reasons, it can change the course and direction of our lives, as well as other people's lives. But the flip side is true as well. When we compromise on the wrong things in the wrong ways at the wrong time, it can cost us way more than we can even imagine. So over the next few weeks, we're going to look at how do we take a stand for the right things that matter the most. So I'm going to kind of give you a preview. I'm going to kind of tell you what we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks. Today we're going to be talking about standing out. And then next week in part 2, we're going to be looking at how we stand up for what is right. And we're going to watch Daniel in the Old Testament. And we're going to take 5 different stories from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. And we're going to see Daniel actually stand up to the king, who had the power actually to take Daniel's life at any moment. And Daniel stands up to him and tells him to stop sinning and to do what's right. It's really a fascinating story of how we can stand up for that which is true. And then in week 3, we're going to talk about standing for what matters most. We're going to see in Daniel here, when we get to that teaching, that the king says that Daniel can't pray anymore for a certain amount of time like he did. And realize Daniel then decides to do something he must do, which is stand for what's right. And then in week 4, which may be my favorite week, we're going to talk about how do you stand in faith and prayer. It's going to be a very emotional message as we look at how Daniel's been praying and Michael the archangel visits him to tell him that God has already heard his prayer, the cry from Daniel's heart. And I believe this will minister to a lot of people in a very deep way as we stand in faith, believing God to work on our behalf. And I think we definitely need that right now in our country, for God to work on our behalf. And then in week 5, we'll wrap the series up. We're going to talk about standing firm in the fire, when there's opposition to you standing firm. And we're going to look at the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how we stand firm when those around us are opposing us. So today, we're going to talk about standing out. And what I want to do is I want you to put your thinking caps on with me, because we're going to lay a little groundwork today, or a foundation that we can build on, and it'll help carry us in the coming weeks. To start with, we're going to jump into Daniel chapter 1. But before we do that, I need to give you a little context, as always, and kind of give you the backstory here. We're introduced to King Nebuchadnezzar, who was king during the time of the book of Daniel. And he was an evil king. And we see that he comes into Jerusalem and destroys the entire city. And this guy is so evil that he didn't just destroy the city, he goes and burns the temple to the ground. And then to add insult to injury, he goes into the temple and he finds all the religious symbols that were in the temple. And he crushes them, destroys them, burns them, as if to say the worship of your God is so obsolete. So I'm going to take out anything that even matters to that and destroy it. But what we see here is that not only did he destroy the city, the temple, and the religious symbols, But to make it even worse, he essentially says, I'm going to destroy your future as well as the present. So he says to his leaders that had gone into the city, I want you to go find the sharpest and the brightest sons of the royalty and the nobles, and I want you to basically kidnap them and bring them back to Babylonia. Bring them to me, because I want to indoctrinate them in the Babylonian culture, train them for 3 years, then they're going to be future leaders in my government. So not only am I destroying Jerusalem and your present, I'm going to destroy the future by taking the best of your best and making them leaders for me, so they won't be leaders of yours. So that's kind of the backstory. That's what we see play out here in the book of Daniel as we start with Daniel chapter 1. The first 2 verses say this. During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Verse 2. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. So we kind of got the picture here. And then we resume with verse 3 through 5. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and the literature of Babylon. And then verse 5. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. In other words, he tells them, I want you to go find those who were probably voted the most likely to succeed, and I want you to bring them to me. Those are the ones I want. Those are the ones I want to raise up and put in my royal service. We saw there that it goes on to say that he wants to teach them the language. Now I want you to really listen to this as I walk through this, young people especially. I want to teach them the language. In other words, I want them to speak like we speak. And then the literature of the Babylonians, he wants that taught to them, because I want them to think like we think. And then the king then assigned a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. And this is really important here, because we're going to come back to it in a minute. And he says, I want them to eat from the king's table. Then they were to be trained for 3 years. And after that, they were to enter into the king's service. Now, here's what I want you to notice. This is a very intentional and strategic plan to indoctrinate these young boys into the Babylonian culture. I'm going to say that again, and I want you to see if we can't pull that into 2020. This was a very intentional and strategic plan to indoctrinate these young boys into the Babylonian culture. In other words, the king wanted them to think like the Babylonians thought, behave like the Babylonians behaved, and believe what the Babylonians believed. This, I believe, mirrors the strategy of our spiritual enemy, the Prince of Darkness, who, we know, wants those who are followers of Christ to think like he thinks, to believe like he believes, and to believe like he would want us to believe. In fact, I believe Satan wants everybody on planet Earth to disregard the teaching of the one true God and submit and surrender to his systems of this world. Now, I want you to understand, Satan can use people, platforms, and positions to do that, disguised as something that looks attractive. So again, I want you to apply that to 2020. And see, we've got this full-on spiritual attack against people today. Amen? We have a spiritual attack against God's people today. As Satan lies and as he deceives and he tries to lure people away from God's best and live according to a lower standard. See, I think we've become so blind to some of this that we don't realize how low we have dropped our standards and the way we have accepted some of these standards. And that's why I would argue with all my heart that it is, I want you to really listen to me here too, that it is completely impossible in 2020 to be sort of a Christian and have any success in this world. It's completely impossible to be what some have called a cultural Christian and have spiritual success. You may ask, well, Tim, what is a cultural Christian? Well, first off, they're everywhere around you. They're people who'd say, when they're asked, do you believe in God? Well, yeah, I believe in God. Are you a Christian? Well, yeah, I'm a Christian. I mean, I'm not something else. And I go to church on Easter and the big holidays like that, or when we're not traveling with the kids and, we're not going to the lake or whatever. And of course, I was born in this country, so yeah, we're Christian. Well, is there any outward, invisible sign? Well, I'm a good person. I try hard. I'm not like some of those religious fanatics, those weird people, those weird Christians. Some people take it a little too far. But yeah, I'm a Christian. Well, that's a cultural Christian. And I would argue all day long that it is completely impossible to be a sort of kind of cultural Christian and have any spiritual success in the world we're living in today, and to have any kind of victory against the temptations and the darkness of this world. You just can't sort of be in and have the victory that God wants you to have. Now, I have said this over and over the last 5 months, that one of the things I think COVID is doing for us as the church is we're getting to see who's in really and who's out, who's committed and who's not committed. I have been saying that ever since this started, that this almost is a test, like we talked about a couple weeks ago when we were in our Inconceivable series. It's almost a test to see who's in and who's out. And I'm telling you, the cultural Christians will not survive the chaos and the temptation and the low standards that we're living in today. It's kind of like saying that if I just work out one time a year, I'm physically in shape, right? No, you know better than that. It's kind of like saying if I just tell my wife one time a year that I love her, and I can't expect her to really believe that if I just tell her once a year. And guys, listen to me. You can't go to church for 1 hour a week or watch online for 1 hour a week, which a lot of you won't even do, and that be it. And expect to be growing and thriving spiritually. In re-up, I kind of say it this way a lot of times. The number of Jesus followers that say that Jesus is the Lord of their life, but yet the average Christian spends 10 minutes a day, which I think that's high now. I think that number's lower. But they only spend 10 minutes a day in prayer and in the Word. And they spend the other 23 hours and 50 minutes focused on everything else. Well, you tell me what you're going to look like the most based on dividing your time that way. you're going to look like the 23 hours and 50 minutes. You can't survive the ambushes, the attacks, the temptations if you're just some cultural Christian. And I wholeheartedly believe that we are in the midst of finding out who's in and who's out. And I hate to say that, but I've been saying it for months. A lot of you that know me personally, we've had that conversation. So you got to make the presence of God a priority in your life, where you seek Him, where you depend on Him, where you're living and dwelling in His Word, where it's feeding you, it's renewing your mind. You're learning to walk by faith and not by sight. You're hearing His Spirit guide you. You just can't sort of be a Christian and have the life and the victory that He wants you to have. In fact, that's why Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 through 13, which are those famous verses about the armor of God, put on all God's armor so that you will be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil. Let me remind you, when the Bible says all, it means all, okay? So put on all God's armor so that you will be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil. For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. Therefore, put on every piece of God's armor, so you will be able to resist the enemy in the time of evil. Then after the battle, you will be standing firm. There's that word, stand. You will be standing firm. Sometimes you have to take a stand against the devil's schemes. But if you are just a cultural, part-time, when it's convenient Christian, you're going to fall. Sometimes you got to take a stand for that matters the most, in the right way, at the right time, for the right reasons. And boy, we're not living in a world today that needs us to stand at the right time, for the right reasons, in the right way. And I would submit to you that if you're never standing out, listen to me, if you're never standing out for God and you're always blending in, I'm not sure how committed you really are to following Jesus. Because when you follow Him, you will be different. When you fully follow Him, you will be different. You will be set apart. The word holy means to be set apart. Be holy as I am holy, God says. And there are times when you have to stand out if you're truly following Jesus. Well, Tim, what are they going to think about me? I mean, are they going to think I'm some nut job? Doesn't matter. See, so many of us are more worried about what people think about us than what God does. And we spend more time focusing on that and making sure people think of us in a certain way than spending the time with the God of the universe who sent His Son to die for us. We spend more time focused on this than we do Him and what He thinks of us. So we're going to see here in the life of Daniel and his three friends, and I want to remind you here, and I'm going to talk about it here in just a second, these are teenagers that take a stand. These are 12 to 15-year-old young boys that take a stand. Verses 6 and 7, let's look at them. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were four of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belshazzar. I never can pronounce that. I'm not going to try to. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. Azariah was called Abednego. Now, why did they change their names? Why did that happen? Well, let's get a little context here first. I said a while ago, these boys were 12 to 15, it's believed. We're not 100% sure, but most biblical scholars would say that they think they were between 12 and 15. So it means they were middle school, freshman, sophomore, and high school, something like that. They've been stripped of their identity because their names just got taken away from them. They've been taken 1,000 miles from their home, Jerusalem, crushed of all their dignity. And the first thing the king wants is he wants their names changed. And again, we ask the question, why? I believe it's because their original names tied them to the worship of Yahweh, God, the one true God. It was the meaning of their names that were given to them by their parents who were worshiped and served Yahweh. And all these new names would be tied to the worship of false pagan gods. So essentially, every time someone called them by their name, it would be a reminder that you are supposed to serve these pagan gods. And every time somebody said their name, it was a reminder that, oh yeah, see, you don't serve Yahweh anymore. You're serving our gods. So they were kind of stripped of their identity. But then they're also asked to change their diet. They're told you're supposed to eat, as we read earlier, the food that's prepared for the king. Now, I don't know about you, when I think about that, that sounds kind of good to me, right? That I get to eat what the king eats. Whatever it is, serve it to me. That sounds like it might be the best. But the problem with that food that was prepared for the king, the meat and the wine, were dedicated to pagan gods. And this created a real problem for Daniel and his friends because they wanted to honor and worship the one true God in every way possible. And to eat or drink anything that had been dedicated to pagan gods would cross a line in their minds and be disrespectful to the one true God. So we pick up with verse 8 here, which is probably the most important verse of everything we're going to look at today. Here's what it says. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. It's very interesting here what we see taking place. I want you to notice this. Daniel didn't resist or fight back, if you want to say that, when they changed his name. Did you notice that? Again, I ask why. Well, I'm guessing because, hey, you can call me whatever you want. You can tie me to whatever God you want. But I know who I am. An outward name does not define who I am in my heart. You can call me whatever you want, but I know inwardly I will always worship, know, and serve my one true God. So my name is not worth standing up for. He didn't defend his name. So when do you take a stand? We learn from Daniel right here. When do you take a stand? He took a stand when God's name might be defamed. He says, I'm not going to let you insult the name of my God by me eating of food that has been dedicated to pagan gods. I'm not going to defile myself and eat that food. And I love this. I want you to see this. I'm going to put it on the screen here. He made a predetermined resolution. He made a predetermined decision. Before the temptation was ever there, he decided what he would do and what he would not do. He predicted. He predecided. And that's why he was successful. You see, had he not predecided, you put the fruit in front of him, I know me, he could have done what I've done so many times in my life, where I've compromised and rationalized something that wasn't really right. I might have said, man, that food actually looks pretty good. I mean, it's good. God's hand's probably on it. And I'm sitting here thinking, I got to eat something, and I'm getting the best. I'll just do it this one time, and God will forgive me. And look, all the other Jewish boys are eating of it. It doesn't look like God's striking them down. So I'll just do it. It's not that big a deal. But here's the key, guys. He predetermined. He resolved in his heart ahead of time. He made a decision before he was faced with a temptation to do what is right. And I would argue all day long, for those of you that are followers of Christ, your success in so many different spiritual avenues of your life will be determined by what you decide ahead of time. Many of you, and I don't know if this is going to speak to you, but I believe the Holy Spirit will personalize it for you. There are some things you need to predetermine in your heart. You need to decide now that no matter what happens in the future, I will always do such and such, or I will never do such and such. I've pre-decided to serve the one true God and honor Him in this way. Even if COVID goes for another year, I'm going to pre-decide that I'm going to spend time with God on a daily basis. I'm going to be involved, if in person or if not in person, online with my church. I'm going to connect to the community of Jesus. I'm going to be intentional about every opportunity that gets presented to me. I'm going to try to take advantage of that. You got to pre-decide. For example, for me, before I was a Christian, I would drink with the best of them to a point of drunkenness. I was good at it. Matter of fact, I probably would have been on the all-star team. But later in my life, in my walk with Jesus, I realized that that's something that I shouldn't be doing. So I pre-decided not to drink, or if I did, I'd just have one glass of wine or one beer. So I predetermined what I would not do. I didn't wait till I was bellied up to the bar with a bunch of my old fraternity brothers when I go back for homecoming or something, and they're sitting at the bar playing some drinking game. It was a predetermined decision. I resolved in my heart not to do this. And therefore, it was successful because it was a predetermined decision. So some of you, you'll predetermine not to do some things you used to do. You see, you may predetermine in your heart not to be involved in discussions at your office or your workplace where people are trash talking the opposite sex or maybe always bashing the boss. You may have pre-decided, I'm not going to be a part of that. So you decide ahead of time, when that happens, I'm just going to walk away. You may be married, and so you may predetermine in your heart not to have intimate conversations with the opposite sex. Well, everybody else does it at work. I mean, she talks about how bad her husband is, and he talks about how bad his wife is. But you decide, you know what? I'm not going there. I'm going to be nice to people, but I'm not going to open up and have those types of conversations. You predetermine what you're not going to do. You may also predetermine what you are going to do. For me, I've predetermined I'm going to church every single week. If I'm in town, there's no doubt about it. The worship of God will be a priority to me. If I'm not in town, or if I can't go to church, I'm going to do church online. Because I need the teaching of the Word to empower me in my life. So it's a predetermined decision. You decide ahead of time before the temptation. I've resolved in my heart. You decide before the event what it is that you will do or not do. But I want you to listen to me here as well. You don't realize the power behind predetermining. Let me give you an example. You might think it's a silly example, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. Company I used to work for, this has probably been 15 years ago. Used to always do this big leaders training in Atlanta, and we'd always go down on Thursday, and on Friday we'd play golf all day at this really exclusive club, and then we'd have our meetings the next day. So this particular time, the guy they put me with is a young man who had a reputation of being quite the rouser. I mean, he took a cooler with him everywhere he went. So we get to the first tee. I put my golf bag on the cart and get in there with him. And first thing he does, he opens up his cooler and puts a beer in front of me. He says, "You want a beer?" I said, I don't think so, JP. I've decided, I've made some decisions in my life, and right now that's just not something I'm going to do. Well, why not? Well, I had something happen with my young son at the time, and he challenged me with something about why I like to drink. And I really couldn't come up with a really good reason. So he said, well, why would you keep doing it then? So I've just decided I'm not going to do that. So we went on, played, and I just pre-decided I wasn't going to do that. He respected that. So the next year, same thing, same time of the year, get sent off. Well, of all things, I get paired up with him again. We pull up to the first tee, jump in, he opens that cooler, reaches down, and I hadn't seen what was in there yet. He's reaching down, he says, hey, you want something to drink? I'm like, no, JP, I don't know if you remember what I told you. He goes, oh, I remember, here. He hands me a Coke. And I look in the cooler, and that's all that's in there, soft drinks. I said, what's up, JP? He said, well, after you told me that last year, and you told me you made that decision, and the question your son asked you, how it challenged you, I asked myself the same question. And I realized I had a problem, and I needed to quit. And he said, I've only drank a couple times since you and I played golf last year. See, he predetermined that he wasn't going to do that with me that day. I lost contact with him. He wound up leaving the company. I don't know whatever happened there, but that predetermined decision made an impact on him. So we don't know the power behind predetermining. Because what you pre-decide in your heart to do to honor God some way, you're going to have to stand out. See, I had to stand out in front of him, and there were other guys around there waiting to tee off when he and I had that conversation. See, if you're never standing out and you're always blending in my opinion, you're not really following Christ to the fullest. And that's what these boys did here. They resolved in their hearts not to eat this food that's been dedicated to the pagan gods. They decided to stand out. And when you read this, I want you to really realize this. This is so important. You don't need to read over this and think, well, that was just a one-time event. When you read that one little verse, but what you don't realize was that decision, they stood out from that point on, day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, because every time they had breakfast, they stood out. Every time they had lunch, they stood out. Every time they had dinner, they stood out. They stood out continually because of that one decision. They made the one decision that set them apart again and again and again and again. And if you're fully following Christ, you're going to find the closer you get to Him, the more often you're going to need to be standing out. And you're not ashamed because of what He has done for you. I want you to see the wisdom here of Daniel. Remember, this is a teenage boy. And I want you to see the wisdom here that we really need to grasp where we're at in our world in 2020. Let's look at verses 12 through 15. Daniel says this to the government leader who's above him. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. I love this. Check this out. What did they do? Instead of making a big protest, oh, no, you don't. We're believers in Yahweh. And we won't eat that food dedicated to pagan gods. Let's get a bunch of signs. Let's kick in some windows. Let's have a big protest. See, instead of throwing a big fit or making a scene, or listen to me here, or instead of going on social media and ranting about something, with wisdom, they presented a plan. They respected authority above them and said, hey, can we simply try something else? You see, you can stand out for the right things in the right way, or you can stand out for the wrong things in the wrong way. And can I just say, there are some Christians out here who are standing out for the wrong things in the wrong way all the time. You know who they are. The Facebook Bible police, you know those guys, don't you? Anytime there's something out there, they're stabbing you with the sword, the word, they're trying to beat you up. They're rude and angry all the time at everybody. They've got the spiritual gift of being annoying, apparently. It's turn or burn, baby. You're going to hell where the worm never dies, and they're weeping and gnashing of teeth. See, you can stand out in the wrong way. And there may be some of you in here who stand out in the wrong way. Some of you watching. You need to stand out in the right way, at the right time, for the right reason. We have to have wisdom. And we need to ask ourselves things like this. God, is this worth taking a stand for? Or is this something that's not that big of a deal? I'm going to tell you, if you approach God that way, through prayer and asking Him that, He will help you with that. Because He wants you to stand out in the right way, at the right time, for the right reasons. He won't lead you astray. See, for me as a pastor, apparently I'm supposed to stand out. If we're not, I'm not an effective pastor, apparently. But I want to tell you an interesting story. Again, may seem kind of silly to you, but I think it relates here. Back in February of this year, before COVID hit, we were in Chicago at the clothing show. And after the show was over that day, a bunch of us went to dinner. And then after dinner, we were leaving getting ready to catch a cab, and one of the guys said, "Hey man, my hotel's just down the street here. We got a great bar in the lobby. Let's go down there and have a few drinks." So we go down there, and yes, I went in a bar. Okay? We sit down, and when we sit down, there happened to be a couple other guys we knew that were clothing guys sitting at another table. They came over and joined us. We all sat around, and they started taking orders for drinks, and everybody ordered a drink, and I just said, I'm not going to have anything. And one of the other guys that had been at the other table that joined us said, "What do you mean you're not going to have a drink? What's going on, man?" Well, one of my other buddies that we'd been to dinner with, a good friend of mine, he stepped in. He said, "Tim, you may not know this, but Tim pastors a church back in his hometown as well as sells clothes. And I know for a fact Tim has just kind of decided he doesn't really do that a whole lot anymore." And so that guy respected that. This guy stepped in for me because he knew my thoughts. We'd had conversations before. But what's interesting is, without apology and explanation, I went to that bar, and I didn't drink, but I got to listen to all these guys. And I got to know this one guy that had made that comment about why I wasn't drinking. I got to know him a little better that night. And I started to build some trust with him. And he opened up, and I started to hear some stories about him. And he asked some questions, and we actually started talking about some spiritual things. And we've kind of become good friends since then. And he reaches out to me every now and then to talk about spiritual things and to ask spiritual questions. Because of what I had predetermined and stood out from the rest of the guys there that night, got his attention. See, I believe that man respected my decision, my predetermined decision to stand out in the right way. I thought at the right time for the right reasons. And I didn't even tell my buddy, somebody else did it for me, which makes it even cooler in my mind. See, all of you get those opportunities. But if you'll pre-decide that you've resolved in your heart that this is where I'm willing to be different, this is where I'm called to be different, I don't care if people make fun of me, this is what God wants me to do. And if you're a cultural Christian, you can't look at it that way. You'll just blend right in. That's why I think it's crucial right now that we decide to step into the game and commit or not. And I'm afraid the ones that don't are going to drift and drift and drift. And that breaks my heart. If you'll just decide to stand and make some good decisions and predetermine some things. So then when we get to verse 19 in Daniel 1, we see this. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. You see, God gave them supernatural understanding. These boys apparently did better in school. So if you want to do better in school, apparently you don't eat the cafeteria food dedicated to pagan idols. You know, that pizza that looks like it's 18 years old? That was a freebie. God gave them the ability here to interpret visions and dreams. And they literally, I want you to listen to me, these teenage boys literally redirected the course of history when you read the rest of the Old Testament, because they stood up and stood out for what mattered most. I mean, think about it. Had they compromised and not had the courage to stand out, nothing historic would have happened. I mean, just think about that. Nothing historic would have happened. I don't know about you, but with all my heart, I'm telling you, with all my heart, I would rather be remembered for standing out than forgotten for blending in. That was really good. That's pretty good preaching, so I'm going to say that again, okay? I would rather be remembered for standing out than forgotten for blending in. If you are always blending in, then I'm not sure you are fully committed to following Christ. Now, we don't stand out to make a statement. We stand out because He's called us to be different. If the byproduct is a statement, then so be it. Because we're going to take our stand against the devil's schemes. We're going to put on the full armor of God, the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, the sword of Spirit, and the belt of the truth. Our shoes are prepared with the gospel of the readiness of peace, and we're going to take our stand against the enemy's attacks. And when we've done everything else, we will stand. Why? It's simple. Because Jesus stood and died for us. And He's called us not to be conformed to the patterns of this world, cultural Christian, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Then we will be able to test and approve what His will is, His good, His pleasing, and His perfect will. See, you can't be a part-time Christian and stand out and have victory. We have been called to stand at the right time, in the right way, for the right reasons. And we are living in a world today, right now, that needs us to stand. The time is right. The reasons are right. And there's a way to stand for our God.